We've made it. Meher Baba of Ahmednagar and the Aesthetics of Religious Symbolism, a series of 10 biographical talks by Dr. James Newell, still me, and this is talk number 10. We've made it through 9. Some of us have made it through 9. Some of us are not sure we're going to make it through number 10 yet. But we made it through 9. This is number 10. This is after Meher Baba's death, and the growth of a movement is kind of looking back on what we've talked about and also what the future may hold. So, welcome. Glad you all came or are listening. We left off last time with Meher Baba's final days, his announcement that he would hold a large darshan program in Pune in April of 1969, and his asking 3 couplets of the Persian poet Hafiz to be read out just hours before breathing his last. In this final talk of our marathon 10 talks on the life of Meher Baba, I want to close with basically 5 main points. The importance of Meher Baba's Persian ethnicity to his overall ministry, the historical importance of his 7-day burial / darshan, the historical importance of his last darshan in Pune, which I just mentioned, in April to June of 1969, some general conclusions regarding Meher Baba's life and work, which are kind of just going full circle back to what we talked about at the beginning, and some of the challenges facing the Meher Baba movement or movements in their efforts to preserve Meher Baba's message, teachings, and legacy as time rolls on. And this may, because there's so many things I want to cover, so much to kind of wrap up, this may go longer than usual, it may not. We'll see what happens. A lot of it depends on how animated I get and off script I go. So, to start out with, as I said, Meher Baba's Persian ethnicity is really central to a whole lot about him, about his work, about his teachings, about how he interacted with his followers, and like that. So, from my point of view and from an historical point of view, I think it's difficult to understand much of Meher Baba's life and work without some understanding of his Persian ethnicity. Perhaps most important in this regard is his love of Persian Sufism in general, and the poet Hafiz in particular. Many iconic aspects of Meher Baba's life and work reflect this, and especially reflect his deep love and respect for his father, Shahryar. Shahryar taught the Persian language to his little son Merog by reading Hafiz and other Persian poets to him. Of course, he grew up, as we talked about in the second talk, grew up in Pune in this very, very rich Persian environment, sort of colonial British, but very much sort of almost an appendage of the colonial government was this rich Persian community in Pune, known as the camp area. Even Meher Baba's prominent mustache speaks of his affection for his father, who always had a mustache, and the Persian Zoroastrian roots of his personal ancestry. And also his tendency to refer to his followers as his lovers reflects his emphasis on the classic Persian poetic dyad of the seeker as lover and God, or the master as the divine beloved. So this whole working out of, we called people, even to this day, people are called Baba lovers, call themselves Baba lovers, because of this rootedness in Persian Sufism. And when we get into later a little bit about Sufism reoriented, although he took out a lot of the Persian and the Islamic elements of the Sufi path, he still kept these very Persian elements of the lover and beloved and the emphasis on that. He encouraged people to read these poets. So, and to emphasize this, we talked about this last week, but I want to go over it again because there's a lot in there for what comes next. So even in the last hours of his life, Meher Baba emphasized the importance of his Persian ethnicity by having 3 couplets of the Persian poet Hafiz read out in Persian by one of his most Persian devotees, Ali Akbar Shapurzaman, who we know as Alaba. It's a whole long story why he's called Alaba, but we won't go into that. So this was not only an affirmation of his ethnic Persian roots, but also a message for all those devotees he was leaving behind. It would seem from his actions and his oft-repeated statements such as, "My time has come," etc., that Meher Baba had much more than an inkling that he would not be living much longer, an erich. picked that up from him. It seems that others did not, but as I mentioned last week, Erich did say that he had a sense that it was hard for him to put it all together, but from all these things Bob was saying, and more than that, just by handling his physical body day after day after day, you could see just how frail and unhealthy he was becoming. So it would also seem from this final reading of Hafiz that he was well aware of the cryptic nature of his life, the cryptic nature of his sayings, and the cryptic nature of his behaviors throughout his life up to this point. And that's illustrated by the content of these, which we read last week. Many of you are familiar with these, but I'm going to read them again. Befitting a fortunate slave, carry out every command of the master without any question of why or what. This is, of course, very important. And he's having this read specifically to his Mondli, but everything that goes to the Mondli is kind of eventually trickles out to the general population of his followers. And this was key to the Mondli, because that's all they really knew, as we'll see as we go on. Without him, they were just kind of lost, because everything that they did was based on something they either were told by him to do, or they kind of knew instinctively that this is what they would want him to do. This is what he would want them to do, rather. So, second couplet, about what you hear from the master, never say it is wrong, because, my dear, the fault lies in your own incapacity to understand him. So right there, he addresses this whole cryptic nature of his whole life and work, and he's saying, just accept that I'm the master, and understand that you do not understand the master. And number 3, I am the slave of the master who has released me from ignorance. Whatever my master does is of the highest benefit to all concerned. So he's answering all of this. This is just, it was 2 in the morning. He died at somewhere between 12 and 12:15. Rather, not 2 in the morning, 10 in the morning. So there's 2 hours. This is 2 hours before he passes. He calls for this, has it read out by all of them. and he's addressing all of the questions that they're going to have after he's dropped the body. This is kind of a really remarkable thing for someone to do in the hours before they pass. After the couplets were read out in Persian, Meher Baba bowed with his hands and gestured in respect, Khuda Hafiz. Now this is, as I said last time, this is both a kind of a humorous reflection on Hafiz. It's the way Persians say goodbye. Khuda Hafiz means literally Hafiz means remember. Hafiz, the poet, was called Hafiz because he was the rememberer, meaning anyone who has memorized the Quran is called a Hafiz, so because they're a rememberer. And Khuda is a name for God, so it's saying remember God. This is what people say, Khuda Hafiz, you're leaving, Khuda Hafiz, remember God. It's kind of like go with God, that kind of a statement. And we discussed this last week as a typical Persian mode of bidding someone farewell, remember God. It can also be seen as a symbolic way of saying goodbye to his Mondli and other devotees, and equally it can be seen as a humorous way of addressing Hafiz respectfully. In Lord Meher, it kind of says, well, he was showing respect to Hafiz because Hafiz was a great poet. Well, that's one. What's interesting about this also is Hafiz is known for having multiple layers of meaning in his poetry, and here this one act by Meher Baba has multiple meanings, just like Hafiz. So it's very, very Persian, very, very like Hafiz, very humorous, and kind of when you put all that together, that this is being done by somebody who's just hours away from his death, it's just kind of a remarkable thing. So the events that followed can also be seen as having a symbolic value for the community of people devoted to Meher Baba in both the East and the West. And the other thing I want to say about these 3 couplets is that even today, you know, people read so much, they find out so much about Meher Baba. 2 things happen when you read about Meher Baba. You're astonished by his integrity. I say this even just as an historian. You're astonished by the level of integrity that Meher Baba maintained, the level of commitment to his vision that he maintained throughout his life, but also by the just complete disregard that he had for what people thought about him. He did things that were just apparently completely erratic, had no obvious reason. Well, whenever you're confronted with those things, if you read these 3 couplets, you kind of ground a little bit and saying, okay, I'll suspend my disbelief at least long enough to kind of read a little more of Hafiz. So that act, I'm saying, is another, you know, I've been looking at Meher Baba through this lens of the aesthetic of religious symbolism. That's just that one act, just a couple hours before he passed away. And remember, he's still, before he's dying, he's still going to great lengths to not utter a word, a spoken word. And there's all kinds of different ways to understand that and the different things he did around that. But still, even in the face of all that, he was not speaking in the way that we normally speak. And that was very symbolic. All of that is symbolic. And now these other things that follow end up being symbolic in ways you could say Meher Baba anticipated, and even in just a sort of an empirical way. Naturally, someone who's a follower of Meher Baba is going to say, well, of course he knew and he did this. But even empirically, all this stuff in retrospect just falls into place, and it set the ground for the Meher Baba movement as it would progress from that time, from January 31st, 1969. So, first thing, there was a 7-day darshan, kind of an unexpected 7-day darshan. The Mandali were largely shocked and despondent, despondent about what seemed to be Meher Baba's sudden departure, even though, in retrospect, to many he seemed to have been acknowledging his impending passing throughout previous months and years. And I could come up with all these different quotations about that. I'll mention just a couple, but in general, he did several things. One of the things he said when he was planning this darshan, people were saying, well, Baba, how are you doing? You're not well, you're sick. And he said, well, you think my lovers would mind if I was lying down when I gave darshan? And they said, no, that would be fine. Well, of course, when they finally did have darshan, he was in the tomb and he was certainly lying down. So, extensive, detailed accounts of nearly every moment following Meher Baba's passing, right from, and every moment, that day, the day before. There's very, very detailed accounts because people were so interested that eventually and the oral accounts and then written accounts of everything were compiled, and they can be found in Lord Meher and in other places. There's some talks by Meherwan Jesawala, which will probably be published in his biography that people are working on now, which he also goes into some details of that, and other people who were there in their biographies, different accounts show up. So what follows here are some edited excerpts from Lord Meher, just kind of setting the stage of this unusual event. Normally, and even at Meher Baba's order, was ordered by him to go ahead and immediately bring my body to Meherabad and put it in the tomb. And normally you just cover up the body and then you go from there. But this is a little background to some of that. So Dr. Ginde, who is a very famous surgeon who would drive all the way from Bombay to see the Baba when there was clearly a crisis in his health. He had been called, he was on his way, he made it just after Meher Baba's. Adi describes that just after Baba flew off, he arrived. And he was with Adi. Adi had driven him there. One reason they were delayed is Dr. Ginde himself had a heart attack in the bathroom. He was in such a state about getting up there in time to help Baba, he actually had a heart attack himself in the bathroom, right where Vinod was living at the time. And were you all living there in '69?
No, we were somewhere.
You'd already moved? Okay, but they had lived in that house. So Ginde suggested that Baba's body should be moved to Meherabad within 6 hours. Meher and the other women wanted to keep Baba's body at Meherabad. Naturally, they were just in a state of shock. They certainly didn't want him to, for as far as they were concerned, they didn't want him to go. And Mani, in particular, argued with Ginde, said Baba had once told me that if he goes into a coma someday and becomes unconscious, he would revive after 7 days. And she was insistent on this. And Ginde said, no, this is not a coma. The heart of a person in a coma continues to beat, and his respiration and pulse do not stop. Baba is not in a coma. Mani did not agree and continued to argue. Of course, she was in a profound state of grief. And interestingly, all of the Lady Mandali, even Adi said that he contained his grief and contained it. Then Meher walked in and just stared at Baba. And he said, then I had to go out and weep and weep and weep and weep because I couldn't stand just seeing Meher there. But eventually all the ladies were weeping. Mani is the only one who did not weep at all. Well, why would she not weep at all? Baba even said a couple of times that first, the one he loved most was Meher, the one he loved second was Mani. And she was such a good worker for him and everything. Well, his order to her was to take care of Meher. And so clearly she just felt like it was her duty to not break down, to be there present for Meher. And a woman who lived, Vesta Clinton, who lived with the Lady Mandali for many years in the 70s, early 70s, told me that when Mera died, just the way many people rushed to Mehrabad when Meher Baba died, when Mera died, she rushed to Meherzad and saw Mani at Meherzad, and Mani just fell into her arms and bawled and bawled and bawled, like on and on, just wept and wept and wept and wept. Well, why would that happen? Because she'd fulfilled her duty. Mera was gone, and now she could finally grieve. So it was grieving both for Mera and for Meher Baba. So this is the scene now, and what to do. They don't know what to do. They're kind of relying on just instinct. They try to remember what Baba had said for them to do. So it was suggested that Baba's, as this argument is going on, they were suggested that Baba's body should be kept in Mandali Hall at Lower Mehrabad for 3 days. Ginde explained that that would be difficult then, if they did that, to move a decomposed body to the crypt after 3 days, because especially in India, this is a problem with the heat and everything. So Arish then said, as ordered by Baba, his body should be taken to his samadhi at Mehrabad. All the Mandali, including the women, eventually concurred, and Mera and Mani requested that the body be kept at Meherzad until 5 o'clock that evening. So it's another, say, 4.5, 5 hours. They're able to kind of try to process everything that's happening. This is very sudden for them. Oops. Okay. So Meher Baba's body then at 5 o'clock was prepared in very specific ways. Padri went to Mehrabad to remove the stones from the base of the crypt. It had a stone bottom at that time, but it had to be hammered and dug out so that there's just bare earth there at the base of the crypt. Donkin went to get an ambulance to remove the body to Mehrabad, and all of the Mandali went to Mehrabad eventually, seeing the various details of the internment. And again, this is quotes from Lord Meher. So after all that was going on, the men and women Mandali returned to Meherzad before midnight. Padri and Shugan stayed inside the tomb the entire night as scores of people lined up to take darshan. Now, word had spread that Meher Baba had dropped his body and they wanted to see him before he was interred. Adi was at his office in town sending out telegrams and making telephone calls to various centers and individuals in India and abroad. All India Radio mistakenly announced Meher Baba's passing at 10 p.m. on the 30th. The next day, announcements were made on the radio several times during the day. The BBC also broadcast the news. News had already reached Bombay by the evening of the 31st, and lovers rushed to Ahmednagar by all available means. Several had arrived soon after Baba's body had been placed in the tomb, and they just started to kind of keep vigil there. Most lovers, whether they were in the east or west, could not believe the news when they received the telegram. They thought it was a cruel hoax, as they were planning to come to Pune for the darshan in a few months. Remember, it was a big surprise. It was a shock, really, when Baba finally said, November 1st, he sent out a circular saying, yes, if you can make it, you can come to this big darshan program that I'm going to hold April and June. So people were just stunned and just very disappointed, because they were, not only because of his death, but because they were expecting finally, after months and months and years in some cases, they were going to see him again. So all that night, Adi's office was overwhelmed with telegrams and telephone calls from those seeking to verify the news. So what followed, as devotees rushed to Mehrabad from all over the world, was an ongoing gathering that went on for 7 days, and everyone was amazed that throughout that 7 days, of course he was packed in ice, but even being packed in ice in India, they were just surprised that his body remained fresh and seemed to be all right. But then after 7 days, they said, Dr. Ginde in particular said, you know, this is enough. We really need to finally do the interment. Of course, by this time, Mani was convinced reluctantly that Baba was not in the coma, was not coming back, and they all had days and days and days to process it and talk about it with people. And so reluctantly, the 7th of February was the final day of darshan, and Meher Baba's body was interred at 12:15 p.m. exactly 7 days after he passed away. Throngs of people had gathered throughout the week, and even more gathered on the day of the interment. Now, I go into all that detail because that whole gathering and that whole sense of people getting together and talking, this is what people do at any funeral. You're able to finally process some of the grief and some of the, just people always want, oh, what happened, where were you, well, when did you find out, all that kind of thing. Well, this would then be repeated annually at the Ahmednagar program. This is sort of like the prototype for the what became an annual convention, or an annual observance. So this type of gathering was to be and still is repeated annually, though for several reasons it has been shortened to just a few days. Named by one of Meher Baba's disciples, Bal Natu, the Amartithi, or the eternal date, this annual celebration of Meher Baba's life is anticipated by his lovers around the world, and especially by those in India, many of whom save and negotiate leave from work just to join the throng of often over 30,000 people who crowd Meher Hill just to bow down to Meher Baba on Amartithi Day. And that's always been a big thing, that on the day itself you get to bow down. And now it's becoming, a lot of people just have to, and they encourage people who can go regularly to not even take darshan at all on Amartithi Day, so that those who come for that can do it. Because even with all, they've got a token system and they have all these lines, and they still find it hard to make sure any of the, just bow down, get up. But even if you do get to bow down on Amartithi Day, it's for like a split second, then you have to get up. And so it's quite a spectacle, anyone who's been there. Now, so that's one thing that has become a convention in the post Meher Baba world. Also, the last darshan on November 1st, 1968, despite his rapidly declining health, Meher Baba had surprised everyone by announcing that he would hold a darshan program from April 10th through June 10th at Guru Prasad in Pune. Now remember, April is the hottest time in India, so it's an odd time to have a darshan program anyways. It's brutally hot. Begins to cool off a little bit when you hit June. This would not be for the general public, but only for those who were devoted to Meher Baba. On Tuesday, the 7th of January, 1969, Meher Baba had dictated another circular, which was eventually sent out around the world. Now remember this again, this is just 3 weeks before he passed away, and people had started buying airline tickets and they were all ready to come, and he sends out this circular. Beloved Avatar Meher Baba wishes his lovers to know that his 3 years of intense work, remember he had seclusion of 3 years where he was doing intense universal work, he called it, where he was pounding his leg. He said this has shattered his health. In spite of this, he has invited his lovers from all over the world to come to him for his darshan next summer, and summer means the Indian summer, for it is the time for them to come to him and receive his love. It is the time and the place, Guru Prasad, 24 Bund Road, Pune, has been fixed, but with the present condition of his health, how beloved Baba will give his darshan to the thousands who will come yet remains to be determined, but it will be, he will give his darshan. So this was kind of insisted on by the Mandali that this be sent out, because they were so concerned about his health and how he was going to be able to do it. This is the period during which he said, well, would they mind if I was reclining? This darshan, Baba says, will be the last given in silence, the last before he speaks his world-renewing word of words. In many ways, Meher Baba's Mandali were at a complete loss after his passing. Most of them, for most of their lives, had known nothing except to follow his orders. Everything they did, every decision they made, had either been in response to a direct order from him, or was an attempt to do what they felt would please him. So now, he's gone. They have these orders to do this darshan. It had been Baba's order to hold the darshan program, and so, after conferring with the Mandali on February 8th, notice this is 1 day after the 7-day darshan, so they're still just in a complete state of, what in the world do we do? We can't even go. These are people who they would not even think of doing anything without asking Baba first, and they can't do it. So immediately after that, they've had all these people coming, and they want to know what's going to happen, and so immediately the next day they send out Adi sends out a telegram throughout the world which said this: despite Baba's physical absence, those lovers who desire to visit Guru Prasad Pune to honor Baba's invitation for darshan up to 10th June can still come, abiding strictly to the scheduled dates and conditions as per family letter dated 1st November 1968. Journey will now include a half-day visit to Meher Baba to pay homage at Meher Baba's tomb. So, and we're talking about with the schedules is there was many, that's why it went from April to June, because there are set days and set schedules, and certain groups could go within a certain window of time. They didn't want to have any more than 500 people at a time. Even that was pressing it, but they could squeeze 500 people into the hall at one time, so they didn't want more than that. And there were lots and lots of regulations and strictures, and many of which are still in place for people who come to India on pilgrimage. So after June 10th, anyone can make, this is still part of Adi's telegram. After June 10th, anyone can make pilgrimage to Pune and Baba's tomb individually or collectively. Understand that all arrangements must be made on one's own. Inform all concerned in your area. Jai Baba. And also in a previous circular, I think the November 1st circular, there's all these restrictions that Baba imposes on people. One of them was that you, if you want to do sightseeing, do it beforehand, but then immediately after you've after you've been at Mehrabad and you're going to go home, then go directly home. Do not go sightseeing after that. People who've gone to India have heard people say, well, you need to go right home, because Baba said so. Well, that's, I think he also said that about 62, but he said it very firmly about this 69 trip. So this is a lot of the practices and the traditions that people observe now when they go to India on pilgrimage. As Adi said, after 10th, anyone can go. And the Mandali just thought, well, people are just going to fade away. We're going to have to find some other way to live. You know, no one's going to send money to keep the trust going with Baba not here. So they just thought everything was going to kind of peter out, and they were just thinking, well, they have to get jobs. What are they going to do? They didn't know. But in any case, from April until June 1969, the Darshan of Darshanas was held at Guru Prasad as Meher Baba had wished. From that time on, and up to this day, much to the surprise of the Mandali, people from all over the world began coming to Mehrabad on pilgrimage. At first it was primarily Westerners, but now the throngs of Eastern devotees have grown into tens of thousands, while since the passing of Meher Baba's Mandali, fewer and fewer Western lovers make the trip. There's still Westerners that go, but in comparison to the huge numbers of Indians and other Easterners, it's almost nothing. And we know that here in Myrtle Beach there's a youth Sahavas, which also was very, very big. Now I think it had only 60 people come last year. Well, Zoe and I went last year, and we'll be going this year and working with the young adult Sahavas at Mehrabad, and there's hundreds who come for that, hundreds of Indian young adults. So there's a shift going on, and this is just part of what we'll see what happens as time continues to go on.
Also, this huge contingent, a growing contingent of people from China.
That's true.
Which is very interesting.
Yeah, China, and also from South America, Argentina.
Yeah.
And but the China, yeah, that's a whole, you could do a whole series of talks just on the China contingent, because that is very, very interesting. And this is just from things, this one woman who translated the discourses into Chinese, she lives in Australia. I think she lives in Australia's boat, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And very sweet lady, and people just found this stuff on the internet. And on their own, on their own started coming. We met this one kid, 18 years old, had come, we met him, he was probably 20, 22, but when he first came, he was 18 years old, came from China, knew not a word of English, not a word of Marathi or Hindi or anything, and went to Mehrabad. And I was included just coincidentally in the conversation between people there, and they wanted to accommodate him because he'd been coming, and he wanted to work, he wanted to do things. But there's this, he's learned more English, but there's this language barrier, so they were trying to, they loved his enthusiasm and wanted him to work, but they had to, the first thing he had to do is learn more English, because it was just, it was particularly difficult for the other workers, the Marathi workers who were there to communicate with him. So it's, anyways.
But Ted found him something he could
do. Yeah, oh yeah, they found him something,
yeah. He's a resident.
Yeah.
I mean, when we were there last summer, he was there for 3 months as a resident.
Yeah, and there's about 30, a group of about 30 Chinese people were there when we were there. Yeah. It's amazing. So, so there are different groups fading, others growing. So these I want to now kind of look at my own conclusions to some degree of what I've been talking about, and some thoughts about the future. So, now time to look back on our overarching thesis and see if we can glean anything from our reflections that might give us some insight into what challenges face the Meher Baba movement or movements as they pursue their efforts to preserve Meher Baba's message, teachings, and legacy. So what I'm going to do is go over, and this is something that I've read a couple times, particularly the first couple talks. This is just my overriding thesis of kind of how I'm viewing Meher Baba, what my claims are, and how this fits in with certain history of religions ideas, and I think it also is just a model for understanding Meher Baba and his life and work without taking recourse to entering into the religious narrative. As I've said before, most biographies of Meher Baba are what they call hagiographies, which is that they're written in order to inspire faith in people who are already believers, and they speak from a position of embracing the narrative being Meher Baba says that he's God, and that everything follows from that. If you're not a follower of Meher Baba, you're going to have often difficulty with that claim, and whether you do or not, you can't expect someone to just walk in and own a claim like that. So this is kind of embracing the fact that Meher Baba has made the claims he's made, how and why he claims them, and I'll take it from there. So, Meher Baba is a young Indian boy of Persian ethnicity named Merwan Irani. He had a visionary experience after meeting the Muslim woman, holy woman Hazrat Babajan. This experience transformed his life and forever changed the way he understood himself and the world. This experience, coupled with subsequent guidance from his spiritual mentors, primarily Upasni Maharaj, but also the others, convinced him that he was fully truth realized or God realized, or rather God conscious. And in the early days, and most of the time when he talks about this, he uses the word truth and God as coextensive, as being the same thing. So he may say he's truth realized or truth conscious. He may say he's God realized or God conscious, but for him they're coextensive. God is truth, and that is meaningful for other things that he said and for understanding why he insists on honesty and integrity and things like that. So as a result of these experiences and this conviction, and what I'm emphasizing here is that he personally was convinced in the reality of this experience, and not just the reality of it, but as we saw with some of his own statements, that this experience was not just something that flashed on him and then faded away. He says it's continually with him, and that continually, that state of being aware that all of what we take as being real is unreal, and all that he was conscious of is real, that is very reflective of why his behavior is the way it is. And we've gone into that more, but right now I just want to say that as a result of these experiences and this conviction in these experiences, Merwan gathered a group of disciples around himself and came to be known to a small circle as a spiritual master. Now known as Meher Baba, fully convinced of the importance of his visionary experience, his worldly mission, and the importance of what he called his universal work, he proceeded to live the rest of his life in a way that he felt was congruent with and best expressed this enduring conviction. That is, this enduring conviction in this experience that he had and the importance of it. So particularly remarkable was Meher Baba's absolute confidence in himself and his work, a confidence which he displayed throughout his life. His self-discipline and his complete focus on fulfilling and enacting his spiritual vision were equally impressive. Just on the worldly, just watching someone who decides, I'm going to go out and achieve something. Well, this is what he wants to achieve, is to enact this spiritual vision. And his complete confidence in that is often disarming. I mean, it's disarming to see anybody with that kind of confidence, but to have such confidence in such an unusual experience is also disarming. So my claim in this whole series of 10 talks has been that entering into the life and worldview of Meher Baba, his ethos, and the visionary realm of his religious claims provides us with insight into a particular aesthetic of religious symbolism and of the human mythic religious imagination. Well, that's a mouthful, but it simply means that when we see what his aesthetic, in other words, what he thinks is spiritually beautiful, and the symbolic way in which he represents that and enacts that in his life, it gives us insight into that particular aesthetic, but it also gives us insight into the human, mythic, and religious imagination. This is a way of perceiving religious experience and religious teaching and religious living, the act of being a religious specialist. It's a very unique way. There are interesting parallels when you read the historical life of Buddha, historical life of Jesus, and historical life of the prophet. There are interesting parallels there, but for the most part, other than those kind of parallels that you'll see in various spiritual figures, his overall teaching and message and articulation is what they call syncretic, meaning that he synthesized many different mystical paths in a way that, as Adi Kairani would say, there's nothing new about it. But on the other hand, what's new is the way he's brought them all together and enlivened them in a very different way. So that's been the claim of my series of talks. That's been the idea when you make create a thesis and have a claim, then you want each of your presentations to support that claim, and that's what I've tried to do. So what I want to do now, in other words, whether I've been successful or not will be up for others to decide, but that's what I've been trying to do, is provide supporting arguments to that thesis. And now what I want to do is, from that position of having done that, see, I'm not going to predict the future, but see what I see as being salient points in Meher Baba's work that are meaningful and important for people now, and why I think that's so. So in order to do that, I want to review some key points that I introduced again in my introductory talk, because we're getting again into the realm of method. When we're talking about Meher Baba, we can just talk about facts and how to interpret the facts, but how I interpret the facts is based on a particular approach, a particular method, which has been history of religions and particularly anthropology. So following ideas drawn from symbolic anthropology and what's called interactionist theory, anthropologist Jacob Pandian synthesizes the field of anthropological study of religion around the idea of the symbolic sacred self. He focuses on two types of religious specialists, or symbolic sacred selves. There's a shamanic type of religious specialist, and there's a priestly type of religious specialist. Now, Pandian also combines this idea with interactionist theory, and interactionist theory sounds complicated. It's actually simple. It just says that human identity, the identity of each of us, is formed through social interaction. So we may say, okay, I'm James. I'm James certainly when I'm presenting a serious academic paper like this. When I play music for my friends, I'm Jamie. And but I get this identity comes from the academic identity I picked up through my social interaction with professors and other academics, and I get the personality of being a person who follows Meher Baba from my interactions with the Mondali and like that. So that's just kind of the basics of interactionist theory. Religions and religious specialists represent a specific kind of symbolic self. In other words, the interaction with a religious specialist like Meher Baba activates a sacred or a symbolic sacred self. And there are other ways to describe that, but for now I just want to get these basic ideas out, and you'll see why in a minute. So the shamanic symbolic sacred self promotes union with a sacred other. In other words, I'm going to say in a minute that Meher Baba, as I've already said in this talk, represents what we would call a shamanic symbolic sacred self. And one of his jobs is to promote union with a sacred other. We have to identify what the sacred other is, and that will be identified by the individual shamanic person. Now, a priestly symbolic sacred self functions in a different way. Functions as a guardian of sacred knowledge and symbols in a social context. And what that basically means, what it means in the history of religions, is that someone has a religious experience. Say the Buddha, for example, he worked hard, he had a religious experience, and started telling people that I am the Buddha means I'm the awakened one, I am awake. Someone said, what are you? Are you a king? Are you a saint? He says, I am awake. That's what I am, is I'm awake. And that's where the word the Buddha comes from. And so he would be considered a shamanic sacred self, whereas after he passed away and people started writing down what he said, and there were these big meetings, and they called the three baskets where the different teachings were put in. There was they were all oral teachings. They had to be written down and categorized, and when you read them, they seem oddly repetitious and with rhythm in it, and that's because they would be chanted. Why would they be chanted? It's because in those days people didn't write things down so much as they memorized them through mnemonic devices of chanting. So by the time they get written down, they'd already been chanted a lot. The point being, those people are priestly sacred selves. They represent the priestly role because they're preserving the sacred knowledge of a shamanic individual. So why is this important to Baba people? I'm going to get to that. I find these ideas to be useful in understanding the focus of Meher Baba's life's work and the unique challenges facing the growing Meher Baba movement, because Meher Baba's shamanic sacred self he promotes, he insists really that people work to have their own direct experience of God. He's always, one of the salient things he's saying about having a direct experience of God. He talks about, I can tell you about having a headache, but until you have a headache yourself, you're not going to understand it. So he's encouraging people like him to have a shamanic experience. At the same time, he encourages people to have centers like this center, like the Meher Center. He encouraged Ivy Deuce. Ivy Deuce said that she would gladly just drop Sufism altogether if he didn't want her to do that. And then he said, no, I want you to put this together. And all of these activities, whether it's Sufism, the Meher Center, centers around the world, in India, this center here, all of those activities by an anthropologist would be characterized as priestly activities. And this tension, so he's encouraging people to have a shamanic experience. Again, I'm trying to look at this from an anthropological point of view. He's encouraging people to have a shamanic experience, and at the same time, he's encouraging them to take on what traditionally are known as priestly roles. So this is the tension, I'm going to say, that anyone hoping to preserve Meher Baba's legacy is going to have to deal with. As I say, throughout his work, Meher Baba's focus was on individual personal experience of realization, and yet, and following anthropological models, Meher Baba would fall into the category of a shamanic religious specialist. And here's why I think this is important. This is a quote from Meher Baba. He says, "Forms, ceremonies, and rituals, traditions, and conventions are in most cases fetters to the release of infinite life." Now, forms, ceremonies, rituals, traditions, and conventions are priestly roles. This is the priestly category. He's saying that they're fetters to the release of infinite life. If they were a pliant medium for the expression of unlimited life, they would be an asset rather than a handicap for securing the fulfillment of divine life on earth. But, this is my emphasis here with the underlining and the italic, but they mostly have a tendency to gather prestige and claims in their own right. They take on an importance, gathering prestige and claims in their own right, independently of the life which they might express. They're designed to express this infinite life, but instead, because they take on their own importance, they actually become fetters and block it. When this happens, any attachment to them must eventually lead to a drastic curtailment and restriction of life. So he's describing this very tension that we're talking about. Now, according to anthropological categories, forms, ceremonies, and rituals, traditions, and conventions are explicitly priestly concerns and concern the priestly symbolic sacred self. Any attempt to preserve the legacy of a shamanic religious specialist, Meher Baba, for example, is also a priestly function. So running this center, me giving these talks, I mean, technically, I'm trying to do these from an historical point of view, so I'm in a priestly role, but it's a priestly role of academia. I'm a priest of academia, not a priest of, not a religious priest. But to the extent, if I shift and I start talking theologically and saying that you should, you know, in order to, which I'm starting to do here, but I'm trying to do it from the point of view of an historian, how you follow Meher Baba and how you do things, that's a priestly role. If I try to preserve Meher Baba's legacy in the sense of it being prescriptive, that people should do this kind of thing, then I'm in a priestly role. But my point is that anybody, you know, I do evening caretaker at the Meher Center, that's a priestly role. I sing on Tuesday nights once a month, that's a priestly role. So anybody who does that is consciously or unconsciously struggling with this dyad. So how devotees strike a balance between the shamanic nature of Meher Baba's primary emphasis on direct individual experience of the sacred and the tendency of the social functions involved in preserving Meher Baba's legacy to have a tendency to gather prestige and claims in their own right is an issue that arises often in the course of Meher Baba's life and work, as well as in contemporary Meher Baba movements. Now, another point that I want to make, Maya is taking as unimportant that which is important. This is from his discourse, first discourse on Maya. The working of Maya also expresses itself by making an important thing look unimportant. From the spiritual point of view, the only thing which has importance is God. Very few persons are really interested in God for his own sake. If the worldly minded turn to God at all, it is mostly for their own selfish and mundane purposes. They seek the gratification of their own desires, hopes, and even revenges through the intervention of the God of their imagination. They do not seek God as truth. They long for all things except the only truth, which they regard as unimportant. This again is the blinding of vision caused by the working of Maya. People pursue their happiness through everything except God, who is the only unfailing source of abiding joy. So this is the tendency also that we all have to deal with in the course. This is related directly to this idea of priestly behaviors, because as soon as we get into a role, ooh, I'm the one who sings on Tuesday night, ha. So-and-so doesn't get to sing on Tuesday night, but I get to do it. So that role takes on an importance. Why? Because what's really important is whatever expression, spontaneous expression of the divine happens to be there, which may happen just as readily through, and there's other things, you know, obedience, and there are these other practical things that Meher Baba says are important on the path to God. But we tend to take those, my point is, as unimportant, and we take these other things, well, I'm going to make more money, I'm going to have all this prestige. We take those things as being important. So that's the myopic aspect of that. Now, I talked, I think last time, about how in 1954 Meher Baba began talking about internal links. This is another, starting way back in 54, he was preparing people for his dropping of the body. And this is what he said then. There is no reason at all for any of you to worry. Baba was, Baba is, and Baba will also be eternally existent. This is in response to people being upset about his final declaration where he was going to be dropping his body. Severance of the external relations does not mean the termination of internal links. It was only for establishing the internal connection external contacts had been maintained till now. The time has now come for being bound in the chain of internal connections. Hence, external contact is no longer necessary. It is possible to establish the internal link by obeying Baba's orders. I give you all my blessing for strengthening these internal links, which is a roundabout way of saying I give you all my blessings to be able to obey me better. But that's his narrative there. So, again, this is continuing from that. Now it should be clear that the idea of internal links relates directly, this is me now, relates directly to internal experience of the sacred other, as Pandian would say, or to the shamanic sacred self. So this internal link business is something that comes up directly, and it seemed like Mayor Baba was setting this up. Anybody can make their guess about it because he did not articulate it clearly. But he knew his model would want to obey him. He set up this this darshan program, knowing full well that he was not in good health and was going to have a difficult time giving darshan. But people for the first time began this business of bowing down the chairs, kind of meditating on a chair, thinking about the idea that he is present. In other words, establishing or strengthening internal links. So, on the other hand, and at the same time, Mayor Baba emphasized the need for groups, centers, organizations, etc. Each of these, and now with him dropping the body, this now becomes apparently the only way people connect to him. I mean, they go to India to his samadhi, they can go to the Mayor Center, but the samadhi is maintained by an organization. The Mayor Center is maintained by an organization. People can come to the Circle Center and have meetings, but this is maintained by an organization. So each of these clearly requires devotees to step into a priestly role, yet the requirement is to do so without the organization gathering prestige and claims in their own right, as Mayor Baba has said. So in order to illustrate Mayor Baba's approach to this, I want to read another excerpt from Lord Mayher relating to a meeting between Mayor Baba and some Western lovers in 1956. This is about groups, running groups, and this was running groups with Mayor Baba physically present in the world. Now this dynamic is still present, perhaps even more so. So I think it's illustrative what he has to say about it. So on Sunday, 29 July 1956, Mayor Baba discussed group work with members of the New York Monday Night Group and the newly formed Sufism Reoriented, a group which was named, formed, and chartered under Mayor Baba's direct guidance. There's a whole long story. We mentioned some of this about how Rabia Martin discovered Mayor Baba, passed away before she could meet him, but passed her charge as leadership of this organization. She had gotten it from Inayat Khan, passed to her, from her to Ivy Deuce, who wanted to follow in her footsteps and get Mayor Baba's approval of this, because she felt she was actually quite anxious about not having any spiritual, certainly no advanced spiritual status, and so she wanted someone who did have advanced spiritual status who could really guide them properly. So she wanted to get in touch with Mayor Baba. She did so finally in 48, and then saw him again when he came for 52, and she wanted a name for this group now that it was going to be focused on Mayor Baba. Baba sent out, here at the center, sent Audie out to ponder it, and Audie came back and said, just popped into my head the name Sufism Reoriented. So Baba said, I like it. So he asked, Francis was there. Francis was supposed to have a Sufism Reoriented in Australia. And they both, he and Ivy both liked it, and so that's where Sufism Reoriented came from. So, John Bass, head of the Monday, this is from Lord Mayher now, head of the Monday Night Group in New York, stood and said, at times, Baba, there is a tendency to unite or try to attract each other's members. They were worried that the Sufism was trying to poach some of their members. And Baba turned to Ivy, head of Sufism Reoriented, and asked, Ivy, are you happy? How do you feel? As she nodded, he said, fine. Are you ready for a nice fight? How do you feel? Laughter broke out, and John Bass continued, I always emphasize that those who met Baba in 1952 do not need any ism, just to read and study Baba's own teachings. Ivy replied, since Baba himself has designed and created a charter for Sufism Reoriented, it is silly to say no ism is necessary. Baba wants his ism. Baba intervened and said, I want you all to bear in mind one thing. I now emphasize one point which I emphasized in India also when I called all together at the Andhra meeting in 1954. I said that for me, there is no need for centers for different places nor different groups with different heads or names. My center is the heart of every lover. Every lover with a heart that loves Baba is a center. The second point I would like to emphasize is that whoever wants to work spreading my message of love and truth absolutely needs a central office and groups of workers who can function from that central office. There is always a need for a group to have a center. You can have many such centers. Myrtle Beach is such a center, and it stretches for many miles. But there should be cooperation, harmony, and the group heads should not try to win over other members from one office to another. Why? What for? When all work for Baba. There should be harmony, cooperation. Baba says a lot more about this in this conversation, and it can be found in Lord Mayhare, but this is the gist, that there should be cooperation. A, there should be cooperation, and B, some groups were having difficulty cooperating. And I think that's certainly true today. This brings us to the current day and questions of Sufism reoriented. What role does Sufism have in relation to Meher Baba's work? He did a lot of work. He did design a charter, and he said some very interesting things in that. It's a very beautiful charter, and he meant it. He says in notes to Ivy and in the charter itself that he meant it to be a template for other Sufism reoriented, other groups of Sufism reoriented, and that anyone could start one. He would approve them or not. He expected Francis, or at least gave Francis a stamp to go ahead and do this in Australia. He also expected to have a Christianity reoriented and a Vedanta reoriented and all these other groups reoriented based on this template that's in this Sufism charter, which is, as I say, very beautiful. And basically, again, it's reorienting all of these established practices around a focus on Meher Baba. And in one of the sets of notes, before the charter was actually completed, or as it was being worked on, he, in replying to many questions from Ivy, there's a collection of notes, and one of them, clearly, we don't have her question, but it implies that she's saying something about, well, since we have this structure, and there are all these different churches, we could be the central church that all the churches would, and Baba said, no, there's already too many churches. We don't want anything like a church. We just want to, people who want the structure can go to the religion of their birth, or they can join some other religion, but the structure is already there. This is a particular kind of structure around Sufism. We don't need more. His point was that we don't need, and I don't want more churches. That's not the point. The point is to simply have people come together and have some, if they feel that they're lost, they have a structure they can work with. Now, there's one example as to Meher Baba's intention and his relation to Sufism. At a meeting at Ivy Deuce's home in New York on July 20th, 1952, a special message from Baba, dictated by him on the 7th of July, had been posted on a bulletin board, and Jean Shaw, who we knew and love her very much, it was very sweet and very honest. It's particularly, you really have to understand the context to appreciate what's going on. It's a very, very important message, and Baba wanted everyone to read it. Now, on the social scale, and Ivy and her friends being somewhere, and Narina perhaps being somewhere on the top of Narina wasn't present there, but Jean was at least perceived by many, to be way, way down the bottom. And she was ordered by Baba to stand there and make sure that every single person read that. And people were just, I don't need to read it, why'd I have to listen to her? But she would have to force people to read this thing, and this is what she had people reading. It's a little poem, and the real punch is at the end. I am equally approachable to one and all, big and small, to saints who rise and to sinners who fall. And you can imagine some self-important person starting to read this silly little rhyme is going to say, oh, brother, they're not going to be taking it seriously. But through all the various paths that give the divine call, in other words, I'm approachable to everybody. I'm approachable alike to saint whom I adore and to sinner whom I am for. And equally through Sufism, Vedantism, Christianity, or Zoroastrianism and Buddhism and other isms of any kind. And here's the kicker, and also directly through no medium of ism at all. So he's saying pretty explicitly that all of the Sufism and all these others are isms that are indirect ways to him, and he's also accessible directly. Now, someone could say, well, that's just your interpretation. Well, let's see what Meher Baba's interpretation is. Baba later explained his message. This poster must have made it very clear to all that I can be directly or indirectly approached. That means through different isms, sects, and different formations, or personally by direct contact, or in the Indian term sahavas, which means literally physical nearness and service. But today we are concerned with Sufism, so I will not go into details about the direct approach. Well, pretty clearly saying there that Sufism is the indirect approach. He's going to talk about the indirect approach. he's not going to talk about the direct approach, which is outlined in detail in the discourses and elsewhere. But, yeah, so I will not go into details about the direct approach, but I can tell those who are in personal contact through love or service that I can be realized by their direct approach. So, there's lots more to be said about Meher Baba and Sufism Reoriented, and the rest of the Baba community, and what's going to be happening in the future, and whether it's Sufism or whether, as I say, this center or the Meher Center or whatever, whenever there is going to be an effort to preserve Meher Baba's legacy, this tendency for the means of doing that to take on an importance in its own right is the thing that the followers of Meher Baba are going to need to struggle with, because it's always true. But he has done nothing but over and over again emphasize this personal direct approach and this personal experience he had. See, you don't hear about, you hear about the Buddha's personal experience, you hear about the Prophet Muhammad's personal experience, but it's specifically, the narrative of it is specifically receiving it from an intermediary to him from God, rather than this avataric model that Meher Baba describes. And Meher Baba's narrative is absolutely about his own personal experience. The personal experience was so overwhelming that he could barely function for years and years. And even when he did start functioning, he was guided by this experience to such an extent that his behavior often seems erratic and like that. So that's my sort of diagnosis of that level of the challenge facing Meher Baba people, because this emphasis on direct experience, emphasis on what an anthropologist would call the shamanic experience, and yet the necessity to have these priestly functions in place so that the legacy can be preserved and communicated and all that. As he says, there needs to be centers and workers, and he notice how when he's almost diminutive about it, he says it's important, but it's just a center, it's just workers. The important thing is the release of divine love, as he says in that other statement. So, the age of followers of Meher Baba in the West seems to be increasing, while the numbers of interest, they're getting older. Vinod's son-in-law likes to say that we're being ruled now by a gerontocracy, which is, it means geriatric people are ruling the Baba world now. It's all old people, and there's no young people involved. So, and it's certainly true. You can't argue with that, at least in the West. In the East, there's a big explosion of young people getting very involved in working at Mehrabad, and we're going to go meet a bunch of them in a couple of weeks, happy to say. So, as I say, while in the East there is currently an explosion of young people in India interested in Meher Baba, an interest that rivals and probably exceeds the interest of young people in Meher Baba during the 1960s in the West. Whatever the future holds, and purely from the perspective of the historian, the biggest challenge facing all groups wishing to preserve the legacy of Meher Baba's message and work will be to avoid falling into the priestly trap of letting the role, the organization, or the vehicle of the work itself, of any vehicle of any kind, to keep it from gathering prestige and claims in its or in their own right. Whether it is the Meher Baba Trust in India, the Meher Center, Sufism Reoriented, or any other person or body, from the anthropological point of view, all efforts to preserve a body of work that is considered a sacred revelation is necessarily a priestly role. The revelation, from the anthropological perspective, is shamanic. The role of preserving the revelation is priestly. Whether simply working at a desk at the Meher Center, sweeping the floor here at the Circle Center, or setting up a storefront center anywhere in the world, these are all priestly activities, and the danger for a follower of Meher Baba will be that the center, the role, or whatever the activity is, may gather prestige and claims in its own right. According to Meher Baba, forms, ceremonies, and rituals, traditions, and conventions are in most cases fetters to the release of infinite life. If they were a pliant medium for the expression of unlimited life, they would be an asset rather than a handicap for securing the fulfillment of divine life on earth. But they mostly have a tendency to gather prestige and claims in their own right independently of the life which they might express. Yet, the tendency when working in organizations is exactly, this is me now, exactly to emphasize at the very least forms, traditions, and conventions. Meher Baba's primary mandate, however, was for direct experience of the divine, which, in anthropological terms, means to support and foster individual, personal, shamanic revelation. I think it was Norina who used to say, our job is to keep them warm in the nest, and I think that's a poetic way of saying helping people to have their own individual shamanic revelation. For followers of Meher Baba, and from an anthropological perspective, a primary challenge for the future will involve the need to hold the tension of these two opposites. Meher Baba clearly encouraged others to maintain centers, to spread his message, and to do work that will preserve his legacy. At the same time, that very legacy is one of promoting spontaneous love for and direct experience of the divine. How this can most effectively be accomplished will be the challenge of the present and the future generations of followers of Meher Baba. And with that, I end my, oops, that's what the, yeah, I end my 10-minute talk. I'm exhausted, I don't know about you guys. Thank you. Any questions, thoughts? I intuited that you would have...
Didn't say a word today.
No, you're doing good. What's up?
I have 2 points. Firstly, right about the time that Baba died, dropped the body, whatever you want to call it, or day after, it was reported, and I've seen newspaper reports of it from Middle Eastern countries, so it clearly happened. It rained for an entire week.
At Mecca. In
Mecca, and it was during the Hajj.
Yeah.
And the pilgrims could not do the Hajj. They had to cancel it.
They could not approach the
because
Kaaba.
The water was this high up to people.
Yeah.
And I've heard it said by various Mandali, and I happen to believe it's true, that clearly is a message telling the world that the place of world pilgrimage is now transferred from the Kaaba to Meher Baba's tomb. Now, whether or not that was a unique event, I've heard 2 different opinions on that.
It was not.
What?
It was not unique.
No, that's what I heard afterward. That first I heard that it never happened in 1,400 years. Then I heard that it had happened a few times.
It had happened in 1925, and there are films on YouTube.
Okay, but it's a rare event, whatever, right?
Yeah.
It was, yeah, maybe once a century. And the fact that it synchronized exactly at the time of Baba's body was laying in state cannot be a coincidence. In fact, I've often said it, and I still would claim it, that it is one of the proofs of Meher Baba's divinity. That the objective world responded to such extent that the most recent avatar impulse before him, that of Muhammad, that was basically shut down by natural forces.
I do think that Pandit's model of the shamanic and priestly is useful, and I also, I'm glad you're talking about this, because I talk to so many Baba people who get very anxious about starting a religion, or arti is nothing but an empty ritual of Baba, that kind of thing. And I think this sort of gives a way of thinking about it that Baba didn't. If it's a ritual that's taking on importance in its own right, if you're somehow being condemned because you didn't show up for arti or whatever.
Yeah.
But I think people project that onto some of the things, some devotional activities. But
yeah, well, it becomes a ritual. It becomes a convention to not do arti.
Right. I'm not going to do arti.
Yeah. Well, so you become attached to that convention, and that's and you're now a priestly figure of protecting the world from artis. Yeah. And there's any of those things. That's the.
But it goes the other way too, where
Sure.
you're supposed to do arti.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh my God, you don't want to go to arti.
Yeah, you're criticized for that, and but any of those things, it's taken on importance in its own right. And me, because I play music, I just love arti because I get to play, and I get to get this whole atmosphere, and I also I love the Gujarati arti. I just think it's one of the most beautiful pieces of music in the world.
It should be taken on whether or not it inspires love for God. That's, if it works, it works.
Yeah, and for me also, having many times seeing Mara Irani do the arti. Believe me, she was not doing a ritual. You might be doing, I might be doing a ritual. Mara was not doing a ritual.